Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jennifer Jabs, and I'm the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at AUMA, and I work with the Infrastructure and Energy Committee. I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar related to the new Enterprise Risk Management Toolkit. This toolkit was built to enhance the strong and effective local governance of our members by ensuring that municipalities have the resources and tools in place to effectively govern their communities. Before I introduce our guest speaker and we get started with the presentation, I want to make sure that everyone is clear on how this webinar will work and the process through which you can participate. Throughout the session, only the presenters will have the ability to communicate verbally. However, everyone here has the ability to ask a comment or ask questions via the chat box in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You can type in your question or comment, and that information will appear in the text box on everyone's screen so that everyone can see the questions being posed. Although you can type your questions at any time throughout the session, we'll actually only address those questions at the end of the session. Also, if you encounter any sound or other technical difficulties along the way, you can type in those issues as well, and I'll be monitoring the chat box as we go along. Please note that the webinar is being recorded, and a copy of the recording will be available online next week. And if you'd like a copy of today's presentation, please contact AUMA Webinar at webinar@auma.ca. I hope that's clear for everyone. So with that, let's begin. This toolkit is available for free on our AUMA website, and I encourage you all to download it. This slide shows you where you can locate both the resource guide and the risk register. If you haven't yet located it, you can go there by going to Advocacy Services, Programs and Services, Enterprise Risk Management, and then clicking on the links for Guide and Risk Register. And you'll see that those are circled in the red circles on the both the left and the right-hand slide. To help us navigate the ERM toolkit, AUMA is joined by KPMG's Paul Groch, who assisted AUMA in the development of the toolkit that we will walk through today. Paul is a senior manager who leads KPMG's risk consulting practice in Edmonton. Paul has assisted a number of organizations in establishing and assessing the maturity and effectiveness of their ERM programs. Paul was one of the team members who worked with AUMA in establishing the ERM toolkit and webinar. I'll now pass it over to Paul.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. Just by a show of quick hands or applause, or if you want to use a smiley face, can everyone indicate whether or not they can hear me all right? Oh, perfect. I even see we got a little winky smiley face in there, so we got a good crowd today for this webinar. So today we'll be discussing AUMA's Enterprise Risk Management Toolkit. As Jennifer mentioned, the purpose of this webinar is to provide you with support in the context of enterprise risk management by explaining the concepts and processes and providing tools so that ERM can be effectively utilized by yourselves as your municipal leaders. Throughout the webinar, I'll be referring to ERM, which is the acronym that we use for Enterprise Risk Management. I'll try to use very few other acronyms, but this is one that we'll use throughout today's webinar. We have 4 topics that we're going to cover today. We're going to start with the first one on what is enterprise risk management. Then we're going to move into and look at the toolkit that's available to you through AUMA's website. The third piece we'll look at together is how to implement enterprise risk management using this toolkit. And the last piece is we'll take any questions that you may have and talk through those. So there are 3 objectives of today's session. The first is to introduce ERM concepts to you and provide you with an overview of the benefits of using ERM. To provide you with an overview of the new ERM toolkit that's available through AUMA's website, and to complete a walkthrough of this toolkit to start to familiarize you with the content and the approach to implementing ERM. So what is ERM? In talking about enterprise risk management, let's first define risk. Risk is the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of objectives. So effectively, it's anything that may impact your ability to meet your municipality's objectives. Wouldn't it be great if we could identify these risks and put plans in place to either reduce the impact of this risk or decrease the likelihood that this risk may occur so that we can decrease the impact of that overall risk on your municipalities? That's what enterprise risk management does. Enterprise risk management is a tool for enhancing the accountability, consistency, and transparency of risk management in your organization or your municipality. So from accountability, it identifies, evaluates, and assigns responsibilities to manage the risk. In terms of consistencies, it brings a consistent approach not only to how you're going to do risk management, but how you'll be communicating that to council and how you can share that with other municipalities. And it also promotes openness and transparency by providing a current record for communicating and managing risk. So on the screen, you'll see 3 benefits of where ERM can be of use to you in your municipality. The first is related to infrastructure asset management. Enterprise risk management can help you identify which infrastructure projects carry the most significant risk and need the most attention. So it'll help you prioritize. It can help you with succession planning. It can help identify where the human resource risks lie in your municipality and help you put plans in place around making sure that that knowledge is transferred in an effective manner. And thirdly, it can also help you around areas like protecting people from harm. And what we mean here is it can help you identify the safety risks in your municipality that can help you protect people from harm. Overall, ERM provides a streamlined process, consistency, and a common language when defining and communicating risk across your municipality. So today we're going to be learning about how you can apply ERM with this definition of risk in mind to help you manage the risks that threaten the achievement of your municipality's objectives. So the next section we're going to walk through is the ERM toolkit itself. This section will introduce the toolkit, which, as Jennifer mentioned, is available through the AUMA website. It's comprised of a PDF resource guide and an Excel risk register template. This tool was built to enhance and strengthen effective local governance of the AUMA members by ensuring that municipalities have the resources and tools in place to effectively govern your communities. In this section, we're going to look through the toolkit. So the first piece is a resource guide. The resources guide has been built with you in mind. It was prepared for first-time adopters and small to medium-sized municipalities with limited resources. The resource guide was designed with the intent of providing you with the background information you need to understand risk and to provide you with suggestions on how to get started with ERM. It includes an understanding of risk, which is the definition of risk we went through together today, the types of risks you may see in your municipality, and why you in your municipality need to manage risk. It moves into another section called Getting Started with ERM. This is the section that goes through how you can build the support mechanisms for implementing enterprise risk management, suggested organization structures, and governance processes. The third piece is implementation of the ERM framework. This is a step-by-step approach designed specifically for AUMA to developing an ERM framework for municipality. This is something we'll walk through together in detail today. And the last piece is a set of appendices, which we'll provide an overview of shortly. So the resource guide, as I mentioned, was built for first-time users. So through it, we've included examples and tips. Throughout, you'll see these orange highlighted boxes, which are meant to draw examples out that are relevant to your municipality. We've also used green boxes to highlight practical tips. As implementing a new process can be a challenge, we've tried to include as many of these as possible. To assist you with implementing the risk register, which we'll go through together shortly, we used pink boxes to highlight how the resource guide is directly linked and tied into the Excel risk register. And lastly, we've used in gray boxes what we call consideration boxes. These are aimed at highlighting the key considerations and questions that you should be asking yourself as you go through each of these sections. The resource guide includes a number of appendices, 8 in total. And these have been really created to help you in implementing enterprise risk management. We've bolded 4 on the screen today, and I just want to talk through those 4 and highlight them to you. The first is a sample of risk management policy statements. So in the appendice, there's 2 different examples of risk policy statements that you can leverage off, so you don't have to create your enterprise risk management policy from scratch. So hopefully this will be a great starting block for you as you create your policies in your municipalities. We've also included sample risk by risk categories. A challenge that a number of organizations run into when they implement ERM is identifying the risks that are relevant to their organization. So we've included several examples of risks and categories to help you in putting your risk register together. We've also included an appendice on holding a risk workshop. Depending on who you may want involved in risk management, you might want to hold 1 or 2 or even more risk workshops to really have good conversations about the identification of risks. And also, we'll talk a little bit further later on about scoring your risks in terms of helping you prioritize and determine which risks are most relevant to your municipality. And the last is an appendice that brings together the resource guide with the risk register. This appendix covers how to use the risk register, and it includes useful tips like enabling macros and the password that you'll need to unlock the workbook. The other document that you'll find on AMA's website is a risk register template. On the screen, you'll see an example of a completed risk register. It's very difficult to read right now, and we did that on purpose. This is a visual depiction of what a completed risk register can look like. We'll go through a few examples today. The depiction comes from the risk register template in Excel. It includes 3 primary activity areas. The first is administration and one-time setup. For example, the name of your municipality and other pertinent details of that nature. The second is risk register components. So this is the risk register, for example, which you'll see on the screen right now, and the risk impact and risk likelihood guidelines. The third is reporting. And this is a fully automated process in the risk register template where by the push of 1 button, you can create individual and council reports. The risk register template was designed to be user-friendly, fully automated, and consists of 3 main components we've just gone through together today. On the screen here, you'll see an extract from the risk register. This is the navigation page, the navigation dashboard. This provides an overview of the risk register tool, and here you'll see the 3 different areas, including the one-time setup on the administration side, the risk assessment, which is where you'll highlight and enter the risk assessment, your risk categories, and your likelihood criteria, and the third being the reporting category. We also wanted to highlight 2 specific areas for you. The first being that there's a button which directly will tell you how to use this tool, so it's the help. It's very similar to the appendix in the resource guide. And also there's a button right here that will let you print the council reports. So that's a high-level summary of the navigation page. What we also wanted to do was talk through what is included in the council report. So the council report is standardized, and by the push of a button, it'll generate a cover page and a table of contents, as well as the meat of the report itself, which is the risk assessment objectives and approach, a high-level heat map, which we'll look at together. A heat map, as an aside, is a great tool that organizations use, as it provides a visual depiction of how all your risks may impact your municipality, as it's graphed through the colors of green, yellow, and red. The council report also includes mitigation strategy, next steps, a complete extract of the risk register, the risk impact and likelihood criteria, and if you've done them, a summary of who was interviewed during the process of putting this together. So the previous section introduced the toolkit that's available to you. The section that we'll now go through is focused on how to embed enterprise risk management in your municipality and on how to implement enterprise risk management using the toolkit. So the diagram that you see in front of you provides an outline of how ERM can be integrated with strategic planning and other how ERM can be integrated with strategic planning and other initiatives in your municipality to optimally provide value. If ERM is not integrated to the other processes you have, it might not be aligned, and it might not provide the right kind of value that you should expect from enterprise risk management. So in the top triangle, we have the strategic planning objectives. These are the key areas of focus for your municipality. For example, providing exemplary service to citizens. In the middle, we have enterprise risk management. As I've noted, to truly add value, ERM should be completed at the same time as strategic planning, with the key risks linked to your strategic planning objectives. That way you can clearly articulate within your organization and communicate to others how your risk management efforts are aligned to your strategic objectives. At the bottom of the triangle, or the pyramid, we see the underlying operational decisions. These are the baseline activities that you do on a daily basis around implementation of actions. They're the operational decision-making processes. For example, budgeting, disaster recovery planning, asset management, statutory planning, and any other types of plans and documents that already exist within your municipality. In this way, you can implement enterprise risk management in your municipality by leveraging off the already great information you have in place. In practice, we find that this leads to an increased ease in embedding ERM. So with this graphic in mind and thinking about how you may be able to embed enterprise risk management in your organization, let's look at how to implement ERM. So this is an extract from the resource guide that lists the steps to implement ERM. This step-by-step approach was created to guide you through implementing ERM. So there's 7 steps, and we'll go through each of these shortly. They range from defining and clarifying the objectives of your program, identifying conditions that may lead to risks, identifying the risks, analyzing and evaluating them, figuring out whether or not these are the types of risks you want to focus on, figuring out whether or not you're managing the risks in the right types of ways, and monitoring and reporting these after you've established what the key risks are. So that was a high-level overview, and now let's jump into the first step. Step 1, documenting your municipality's objectives and actions. This step's focused on identifying your goals and objectives and to get you thinking about how can ERM support you in achieving those objectives. The questions you can ask yourself during this webinar related to this step are: what are you trying to achieve in your municipality? What are the specific goals that you have in your municipality? For example, what do you want to do, and by when do you want to have that done? What are the key strategies or actions required to achieve each of those objectives? So on the screen are a listing of activities that can help assist you in completing this step. The first is assessing your readiness. So this is assessing the degree to which your municipality has developed a clear approach for managing change. You've likely already encountered risks in your municipality before, and it's about looking at saying, how have we addressed those risks and our ability to manage the change arising from those risks in the past? The second is focusing on your people. So you need to focus your approach on involving your people in risk management. So you want to ensure that everyone in your organization is involved in this, be it through council, through yourselves, and also engaging others so they understand their role in risk management. Even that's as simple as just letting others know where they have a perceived risk, to have that kind of conversation to say, hey, we're seeing this risk out there. Is this something that we should be monitoring in our risk management processes? The third is appointing a champion. And this is appointing a senior person with comprehensive understanding of your strategic objectives to be a champion for ERM. In practice, I found this to be very important to the success of an ERM program. You want someone with the right level of authority to lead and champion the program, but not someone who's so senior that they don't have time to do the day-to-day responsibilities as well. The fourth point is about defining appropriate behavior. And what you want to do here is make sure you provide clear targets on what kind of risks the municipality is willing to take on in the pursuit of its objectives. We'll talk a little bit more about setting a threshold a little later in this webinar, but this is really about saying what kind of risks you want to avoid or minimize, and for each category of risks, what constitutes too little or too much risk. fifth point's about defining roles and responsibilities. Often overlooked, but it's very important to define who does what when and who's accountable to whom through ERM. And the last point's creating a committee and ERM policy. So you can create a committee within your municipality to provide overall direction if you have the resources to do so. And you can also create, and creating a committee also creates a clear link to having good governance in your municipality. And a lot of the things that we talk through here can be captured in that ERM policy, an example of which is included in the appendix to the resource guide. So the next screen is an extract from the Excel tool for the risk management template. So this is where you can document the objectives and approach to ERM. This is part of step 1 and getting started with ERM, including building support for ERM, talking about how you can integrating it into your existing processes, and defining the roles and responsibilities for enterprise risk management. So on your screen, we've included some examples of objectives of your municipality. These are just 2. You may have more in your municipality. And they're as simple as providing environmental stewardship or a high quality of life for your citizens. So these are examples of the broad-reaching statements of objectives of your municipality. In the bottom box, we've included some examples for you to consider around how you will approach implementing ERM. And these include how you will embed it, who's responsible, what are the timelines, and how often will you report on ERM. So this extract will automatically be included in the council report or any reporting through the button that you've seen earlier in the navigation page. And we've also included throughout the risk register a navigation button for return to beginning, which takes you back to the navigation page itself. So that's step 1, really around determining what your objectives and approach to ERM will be in your municipality. Step 2 is identifying internal and external conditions. This step will help you in identifying the risks that threaten your municipality. It's focused on internal and external risks. And what we do is we define internal risks as what's happening in your municipality, and external as what's happening outside your municipality. This step really exists to get you thinking about what are the conditions, what are the things out there that may impact your municipality. We'll look at some examples on the following pages. Before we do these examples, I just wanted to note for ease of implementation, Appendix 2 of the program guide, the resource guide, includes examples of internal conditions. 3 are highlighted on this screen. So the first that might be relevant to you and your municipality is change and the continuous rate of change. This includes changes in demand for additional and or different services and how fast these are accelerating. A second internal factor can be change in workforce demographics. Substantial and rapid demographic shifts within the workforce can introduce risk through diminished municipal knowledge. In addition, many next-generation employees may have a different or non-traditional set of priorities with respect to work terms and conditions. So this really deals with identifying how you'll manage that in your municipality. And the third is technology. Technology is ever-changing and hard to keep up with. Examples of these conditions aren't just obsolete or old technology. It's how the use of new technology and technology used by your employees can result in new risks, like protection of information through cybersecurity. The next section we'll look at is some examples of external conditions. Again, there's examples within Appendix 2. So on the screen we have 3. The first is demographic shifts. So demographic factors relating to age, marital status, etc. can impact citizens' needs and demands. Economic factors such as inflation, commodity prices, unemployment rates can generate financial and capacity risks within your municipality. And the third is infrastructure. The condition of external assets such as computer networks, buildings, transportation systems, and roads can impact service delivery and operations. As you go through step 2, you'll note that there's conditions you feel like you can control, and there's others such as technology. You'll note that there's certain ones you can control, such as technological risks, and others that you can't, like natural disasters. These are called controllable and uncontrollable risks. From this point forward, which is also the focus of the toolkit, we'll focus on those risks that are considered controllable. These are the risks that you'll be able to identify and score, and also look to implement mitigating strategies to help decrease the impact or likelihood of these risks. Step 3, identifying the risks. Now that you've taken the step to identify external and internal conditions, you can identify the risks that may arise from those conditions. Keeping in mind that risk is the effect of uncertainty on the achievement of your municipal objectives, you'll want to ensure that you clearly articulate what the risk associated with the condition is. To help the process of clearly articulating risks, under enterprise risk management, the conditions are assessed for the risk event and the risk consequence. A risk event is a situation that can give rise to risk. The risk consequence answers the question of so what associated with the risk event. Now, as a practical tip, as much as possible, you want to try to be as specific as possible in defining the risk event and consequence, rather than aggregating or being general. Some examples from my past experience include identifying a specific major infrastructure project that carries more risk than the rest. You might have a number of infrastructure programs in your municipality, but there might be one specific road or bridge that might be unique in nature, might be extremely controversial because of the amount of budget that's being put forward towards it. So you may want to flag these as a separate risk specifically for that specific project, not aggregated with your other infrastructure programs. Also, based on my past experience with ERM, I strongly recommend you're clear in your risk event and consequence. If your condition is an aging workforce, you don't just want to say, we don't have people as a risk event. You'll want to note the time frame in an event like that to help people understand when it may become an issue. So rather than saying we have a lack of resources, you'll want to time bound that through saying we have limited resources available next year or in 5 years, as that'll help people understand when that risk event will come to pass. And you'll also want to be clear when you articulate the consequence to make sure that someone understands what is that consequence. So for example, if you said your risk event is a lack of understanding of new legislation, you don't just want to say your consequence is regulations. You want to say that the consequence is non-compliance with regulations to help a reader or a user of your enterprise risk management really understand what that issue will be. So now that you've gone through the process of identifying conditions, risk events, and risk consequences, a recommended practice is to complete an overall view of the risks to see where the themes and trends are. This helps identify the areas that can have the most impact on your municipality. And what you may find in some instances is that you might have risks that seem the same. To help you do this, ERM uses what's called risk categories. These are groupings similar to the way that you can group together types of animals into those that eat vegetables, meat, or both. You can group risks into categories in a similar way to help you evaluate them and identify the areas that have the most impact on your municipal objectives. For example, you may find that 10 of your risks relate to the safety category or a legal regulatory category. As a result, this might indicate to you that this is the most significant category for you to consider in implementing your ERM program and help you prioritize your resources and your risk management efforts. So to help you, we've included 11 categories for grouping risks in the resource guide for your consideration. They're further outlined with examples in Appendix 3. So on the screen, you'll see an example from the Risk Register toolkit. So what we've done here is we've highlighted the areas that we've covered within the Risk Register. So the first area you'll see circled in red is the risk category. So this is examples of the high-level categories that you can see grouping together. And on the screen, you see safety risk and human resource risk. The second and third areas that are circled in red are the risk event and the risk consequence. So these are the areas that we've gone through so far, and what we'll look through next is how to evaluate the impact and likelihood of these risks on your organization. The fourth step of the ERM toolkit is focused on risk criteria. Risk criteria are the key tools that you can use in answering the questions of how likely is this risk to happen? And if it happens, what is the result? So likelihood, or risk likelihood, is how likely is it to happen. And ERM uses the term of impact to define if it happens, what is the result. These criteria are used to help you set priorities and identify what are the key risks to your municipality. Through the process of identifying the risks, you may come up with a list of 50 or 60 risks. But as a municipality, it's probably not feasible, and you probably don't have enough resources and time to dedicate to managing 50 or 60 risks. So this step of ERM is really there to help you identify what are the top risks. As a result, in practice, I always tell organizations that this might be the most important part of setting up your ERM. Depending on the scores you assign to the likelihood and impact of risk, it can result in the risk being something that you monitor and look to control in your municipality or not. As a result, you should carefully assess the score for each risk and ensure that anyone involved in ERM, including council, is in agreement with the scores that are assigned. Now on the screen, you're going to see an example of two outputs from the risk register. On your left is a heat map that I referred to earlier. This is a tool that provides a visual depiction of the risks identified in your municipality. It's a great tool to put forward as a summary of your municipality's risks on one page. It also uses a color scale that you're familiar with, very similar to a traffic light approach, of which risks are the most significant, those are the ones in red, and the least significant, those are usually the ones in green. In practice, when working with municipalities or other organizations, we tell them to focus on the ones that are in red, to look at how they can reduce either the impact or the likelihood of those risks in the municipality. That's why this is such a great tool for you to use. Now, on the right side, you'll see an example of a risk register. Now, this isn't as detailed. This is a summary level register that's used for a lot of boards and councils. It just lists out the risks, numbered 1 through 10 in order of priority, and gives them a risk reference. And the risk number is a specific ID that gets tied back to the risk heat map. It also includes a likelihood and an impact score on a scale of 1 to 5, and also a risk total, which is an arithmetic multiplication of the likelihood multiplied by the impact. So why don't we take some time here to just look at how some things get mapped and scored on the risk map. So looking back at the risk map on the left, the horizontal axis, the one on the bottom, reflects the likelihood of the risk event happening, whereas the vertical axis, or the one on the left, reflects the impact of the risk event. So let's look at something that's considered a low likelihood, high impact event. For example, a natural disaster, like a tornado or a flood. These are unlikely to happen here in Alberta, but if they do, they can have a significant impact. So these are likely scored with a likelihood of 1 and an impact of 5. So when we look at this matrix, we'll see that it'll have a likelihood towards the bottom and an impact towards the top. And it might result being graphed on your risk heat map where you see this little sun symbol. So this would imply a total risk score of 5, which is the likelihood of 1 multiplied by the impact of 5. On the opposite end of the spectrum, let's look at a low impact, high likelihood event, like staff turnover. This is typically a lower impact and high likelihood event. And the reason we say that it's high likelihood is this happens on a day-to-day basis in most organizations. And usually these aren't the senior positions that we're talking about, but they might have a slightly higher impact because someone senior may turn over. So that's why we may score it with an impact of 2 and a likelihood of 5. So this would result in an overall risk score of 10. What we want you to take away is that the further a risk event is to the top right, the more extreme the negative consequence could be. So to help you in assessing the top risks, a risk score, which is the multiplication of the impact multiplied by the likelihood, is used to help you create a ranked top risk rating. This top risk rating listing will help you in prioritizing and determining what are the most important areas for you to consider in your municipality. As you go through this tool, I really want to note that the tool and the risk register will automatically identify these heat maps for you. You won't have to go through the exercise of mapping this or determining what are the highest risks based on the risk likelihood and the risk impact. It will automatically be created for you. So in step 4 here, what we've done is created the risk likelihood and risk impact, which are referred to as the risk criteria within ERM. So this will help you in identifying a listing of the top to bottom risks, so the ones that will impact your municipality the most to least. The next section that we want to look at is really around risk tolerance and risk mitigation. So far we've covered identifying and scoring risks. Next we'll look at how you will determine if the overall score or level of risk is acceptable, or if you need to take actions to mitigate these risks. For example, you may find that you've determined 50 risks within your organization, 25 of which you've scored over 20. And this next section is about determining whether or not you want to look at all those risks or whether or not you just want to focus on the top 5. So I mentioned the last step can be one of the most important in terms of identifying what are the key risks. This step is the most critical step in terms of determining how you're going to manage the risks and impacts and the level of effort required to manage the risks. So the first question that we always ask municipalities and organizations when going through this piece is the level of risk acceptable to you? In other words, is the level of risk reasonable and justifiable for your municipality to take? Or do you want to take further action? The heat map is a great tool in helping you assess your top risks. Many organizations focus on the top risks. I want to emphasize that this isn't the top 10 risks per se. It's based on the top risks based on a threshold. The threshold applied is based on a total risk score that's deemed acceptable to your municipality. As a municipality, you may determine that any risk with a total score under 15 is acceptable, and only focus on those above 15. In doing so, ensure you document this threshold and apply it consistently throughout the year. Now that you've identified the risks you want to manage, what do you do? So we've come down to a list of 5, 10, or 15 risks. What's the next step? So under ERM, there's 4 strategies that can be taken to reduce the likelihood and/or impact of a risk. Mitigation actions should include a timeline for monitoring and confirming implementation of mitigation actions. So basically we're just saying that you'll want to ensure that you set timelines and time frames for implementing your control mitigations, and also assign them to an individual in your organization. So within ERM, there's 4 strategies. The first is mitigate, the second is avoid, the third is transfer, and the fourth is to accept. In terms of mitigate, this is really around putting controls or processes in place to decrease or manage either the likelihood or impact of a risk. For example, putting oversight controls in place related to a major infrastructure project so that you have more insight into cost and time. You can also avoid the risk. You can say, we're not going to proceed. You can find another way to achieve the required objective. For example, we aren't going to build that road or bridge, as the risk associated with doing so is too much. While this may sometimes be the best solution, don't overuse this option. Prudent, bold thinking is important. Risks cannot always be avoided or eliminated completely. There will always be an element of risk in anything that you do. For example, we drive or travel in vehicles to work or for pleasure despite knowing that serious accidents can occur. So you can't always avoid every type of risk or decrease the risk level to 0. A third mitigation strategy is to transfer the risk. This is transferring responsibility for the risk to a third party, usually by purchasing insurance or signing a contract. For example, as you build a bridge, you might put a mitigation strategy into the contract by putting cost reductions or penalties associated with delays with your contractor. The fourth mitigation strategy is to accept the risk. So you can say that we will accept the risk as it is, because there might not be no other options, are the options associated with risk management are too costly. For example, although the risks exist, and although there might be certain costs we can't transfer, we're going to accept the risk and we're going to build the bridge. So in terms of looking at risk management, you can say we have a high risk associated with this project and we're going to take some steps to mitigate or transfer this risk. You might just say we're going to avoid this risk completely and we're not going to enter in this area. Or you might say we're going to accept this risk and move forward. As long as you document your mitigation strategy, you are effectively applying enterprise risk management. I've worked with a number of organizations that have said we're going to accept this risk associated with our project, and they document that risk acceptance. And it's, as long as they've documented that, they've always had the benefit of hindsight of saying, okay, maybe we had the wrong assumptions at the time, but no one's ever said, oh, you didn't do anything to manage that risk. They said, well, we documented our consideration and we chose to accept the risk. So this is an example of a high exposure risks at a municipality and some risk mitigation strategies. This is from the risk register template. As you'll see, it highlights the total risk score and creates a one-page document where the mitigation plans can be tracked. So this way it creates a one-page document for you to use in terms of mitigation strategies and planning associated with your risk statements. Again, this is automatically included in the reporting that's generated from the Excel workbook. So now we're going to move to step 6, which is completing the risk register. But before we do that, I just want to do a quick recap. To date, we have considered and identified the risks. We've decided whether or not a risk is acceptable. We've identified some risk mitigations. We've allocated responsibility. And we've determined a course of action. In this step, you'll consider whether you've taken sufficient action to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. So not surprisingly, this step is focused on answering the question of, have I done enough? What is the risk after mitigation strategies are applied? My apologies. So how do you assess if you've done enough? In the previous section, we talked about establishing a threshold level that your municipality considers as an acceptable amount of risk. The best practices here are really around working with those charged with governance, be it council, and those that are responsible for implementing risk management in your organization to say, at what level are we comfortable with the amount of risk we're taking on? So are we comfortable with a score level of 10? And then looking at saying what risks are above that score level of 10. So it's really about having those conversations and working with others in your municipality to say what threshold is considered acceptable. The other way to look at it is saying what threshold is considered unacceptable. So if, for example, our citizens obtained a copy of our risk heat map and saw we had something scored as 20, and we thought that was acceptable, but would our citizens think that's unacceptable? So might we want to do some additional pieces to bring the risk below that level of 20? Or you could say, is anything above 8 unacceptable? And in practice, what you might find is you'll have these discussions and go through this process and find that if it's over 10, or if it's over 20, you might have 10 risks. If it's over 8, you might have 40 risks. So the consideration that you need to do is not just what is our level of comfort. Secondly, it's around saying, what can we take on? Can we manage 10 risks? Can we manage 40 risks this year? What is the amount of effort that we have available to dedicate to ERM? And what you'll want to do is document this consideration and say, well, we are comfortable with everything over 20, but this year we can only focus on the top 10 risks, which means that we're only looking at things over that 25 threshold. So you'll have to go through that process in terms of figuring out what are you comfortable with, what types of resources do you have in terms of time, cost to dedicate, do you need to hire consultants to help you in this process, and ultimately, you need to make sure you document this consideration and reassess it on an annual basis as you continue to implement ERM. So this step here is about saying we've identified our risks, we applied a threshold, and we've identified some risk management or risk mitigation strategies. And in this process, in this step, we're going to say, are we doing enough? So we said the level of risk was going to be extremely high to the organization, to our municipality. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself here. So this is an extract of the risk register. And what it's meant to do is bring in some of the concepts that we just looked at. So if we look at the first one, and this is around safety risk, we may have identified that the first risk rating resulted in an extreme rating. And what we mean here is maybe we said the likelihood is 4, and the consequence was a 5. So it resulted in an overall total risk score of 20, which would lead to an extreme risk rating under ERM. So what we're planning on doing is doing some safety training and looking at safety regulations as our mitigating strategies and controls. So based on that, we think it won't decrease the likelihood, but it might decrease the consequence. So now we've assigned a likelihood of 4 and a consequence of 4. So this results in a total risk score of 16, where previously we had identified a total risk score of 20. So now, rather than being an extreme risk, the remaining risk rating is deemed to be high. So what you want to do in this step is saying, are we comfortable with high? Is high and that total risk score of 16 acceptable to us? Is it below that threshold? So that's where you're able to, in this column with the sun beside it, document whether or not you feel you're doing adequate or inadequate mitigations. And this will help you determine whether or not you want to do more in your municipality. And to the right, you'll see this is where you can document what you're going to do. And this condition is, for example, will treat the risk by doing more around it. And maybe we'll do additional safety training, and we're also going to do audits of our people to make sure that they're doing everything the way that we expect them to. So this is an example of the thought process you can go through in terms of determining, are we doing enough in our municipality to manage the risk, and are we comfortable with the overall level of risk that we perceive is remaining once we implement the controls that we want to put in place. So now we're reaching the final step of implementing ERM. So to date, we've identified our risks, we've scored them, we've put them into a risk register. After putting them into the risk register, we've used the Excel tool and a heat map to help us identify what are the key risks, what are the top risks that can impact our municipal objectives. So from there, we've looked at it and said, what kind of risk level are we comfortable with? And what kind of strategies do we want to have in place to manage these risks further? And then the last thing we did was say, based on these strategies for managing our risk, are we doing enough? The last step we're going to look at is monitoring and reporting. This step exists for the sole purpose of saying you've done a lot of great work in establishing and implementing a risk register. Now throughout the year, what you want to do is make sure you don't lose that traction. So what you'll want to do is implement a series of monitoring and reporting periods to check in and say, are we doing what we were expecting? We said we're going to decrease the risk through implementing controls. Have we implemented those controls when we expected to? That's the monitoring piece. The reporting piece is really about giving information to council, maybe to your CAO, and saying, we said we're going to do this, this is how we're doing. This is where the level of risk is in our organization. These are, the types of controls we wanted to implement and mitigations we wanted to do. So remember, with the push of a button, the risk register will create a risk report for you. So the process of doing the monitoring and reporting is not meant to be cumbersome. It's meant to run the report for you to spend some time. You can do this monthly, quarterly, whatever you establish as your approach to ERM. As a leading practice, we suggest doing this at least twice a year in terms of checking in and monitoring on your ERM status. And then the ERM toolkit will create the report for you to give to council. So there's not meant to be a lot of time in creating the reporting. The tool's meant to help you get that time so you can evaluate and assess the impact of your ERM program. The last graphic we wanted to show you as part of implementing ERM is to note that ERM is all about continuous improvement. You can't go and implement ERM and on the first day expect to be the most integrated, the most advanced organization that's ever implemented ERM. In practice, the only organizations that we work with at KPMG that are considered to have integrated and extremely advanced ERM are those in financial services and insurance. The other industries range from having more of a sustainable level to a mature level of ERM. And the reason I want to flag that to you is the first time you implement, you're going to learn a great deal about ERM and the risks at your municipality. When you sit back and you look at it 6 months later or a year later, you're going to say, wow, I understand ERM now better. If I could have done it all over again, I might have done something different. So you'll find ways of making it better. So what we wanted to highlight here is some practical tips in continual improvement of ERM. And the first is that ERM, it requires updates to the process and documentation. You might find that throughout the year you want to update your risk register because you didn't articulate the risk in the type of way you wanted to. We recommend that you should update your risk register at least annually. The second is, as risks, they're continually changing. There might be an emerging risk that pops up on your radar 6 months into it. You might go to the GFOA conference and find out that people are talking about a specific area, and you feel that the risk level is high to your municipality. So as risks are continually changing, risk management should be part of your municipality's culture and decision-making process. So that's why we suggest creating that risk management policy and documenting your approach to ERM in the objectives section of the ERM tool. The third is you really want to make sure that ERM is linked to your overall governance to provide a top-down approach to encouraging ERM practices. Tone at the top, it starts from the top. So you'll want to make sure your council's involved in enterprise risk management and your CAO are, so that they set the right tone for the organization and that ERM can be embedded and successful in your municipality. And the fourth piece is based on the significant risk areas, you'll want to complete regular reviews to ensure that your risks are appropriately managed and that your risk management efforts are succeeding. So when we work with organizations, we say, check in throughout the year to make sure you're doing what you expected to on risk management. At the start of the year, define what success will be for you in ERM. Is it about establishing a risk report, looking at it a few times throughout the year, and then creating a report at the end? What do you consider success in implementing your ERM program? So today we've talked about ERM, including the benefits that it can have in your municipality. And if you walk away with nothing more than this, I want you to remember that you can find a toolkit and a resource guide on AUMA's website. It'll provide you with an overview of both documents. The resource guide does a fantastic job of walking you through the step-by-step instructions we've covered today. And there's also a fantastic risk register available for you. It's an automated tool, so you don't have to start from scratch. It's based on a number of industry and global leading practices for you to leverage off in the municipal sector that you'll be able to use in implementing ERM. Every successful organization faces and manages risks, and every municipality responds to risks in an appropriate way. What this tool is meant to do is help you capture all the activities that you do in a systemic and consistent manner, and hopefully someday will lead to the ability for you to share your risk management tools and techniques with other municipalities. Thank you for your time. We'll open it up for any questions.
Thank you, Paul. That was great. I'm just going to go first to some of the questions that were in the bottom left. Feel free to type in your questions. The first question we had is, what is the best practice to getting or to setting up your threshold? So I'm just going to move the slides back to where we were when that question was asked, which is right here. And I believe the question was around the idea of when should we mitigate, avoid, transfer, and accept? And at that point you had said depending on your risk threshold. And you had mentioned it again later, Paul. So if you could talk a little bit about how a municipality should determine whether their threshold is 8 or 20, or just talk a little bit about that. And if I didn't get that question right, if you could add more details, that would be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think this is a great question in terms of the best practices around setting up a threshold. So what I'm hearing in here, and I'll break it down into two different areas. The first is, what are the best practices in setting up a threshold? And the second is, what can we do to reduce the risk? So in terms of the first piece, whenever we work with organizations, we always say, what you want to do is you want to look at that overall heat map and say, how worried are you about the risks that are in the red? So this is really about looking at the first area that I'll say is the total risk score. So this total risk score is meant to give you a level of understanding of the severity that that risk might have on your municipality. And we say, look at that chart and tell me, are you comfortable with where those risks are? And a lot of people say, no, we're not. And we say, where would you like them to be? And they'll say, well, we want them in yellow. And then we'll say, do you want them in yellow just because you prefer yellow as a color to red? Or because the yellow area is associated with something that might have a lower impact and likelihood on your municipality? And what we find in working with a number of organizations is two things. One, they just want to show that they can move the risks down. But by having this discussion around where are you comfortable, it really helps determine the range of where total risk scores are comfortable. So once you're able to identify, using the heat map, what area you're comfortable of, you can help get a total risk score. But what we always try to do is say, that's great. So in an ideal world, now we're going to manage all the risks above that total risk score. And what we find in doing this exercise is that a number of organizations will identify 20 risks that are above that total risk score. And we'll say, so do you have enough resources and time and budget to dedicate to manage 20 risks? And what they'll say is, no, we don't. And then what we'll say is, okay, so how many of these risks do you think you can manage? So the second piece, in addition to identifying the total risk score, is doing a look back and saying, do we have enough resources to manage these risks that we've identified in that area we're comfortable with? And what a lot of organizations come back to and say is, well, we really only have enough resources to manage 10 of these 20 risks. And they say, but we're still not comfortable with the remaining 20. So what we tell them is, this year, as you go through your ERM, you should monitor and report and put implementation plans in place around your top 10 risks. But what you should also do is just kind of report on the other 10 risks that are included in there. So document and say, we only have the budget and resources to focus on the top 10, but we acknowledge that there's these other 10 risks that we're not comfortable with. So we say focus on the top 10, put all your efforts in there this year, and then as you go through the year, if you're finding that you have time or capacity to take on additional risks, start bringing some of those risks from the second tier into the first tier. And then next year, look to bring in those second tier areas into the first tier. So it's really about helping prioritize based on the resources you have to determine what is that appropriate threshold. So in terms of the first piece on the threshold, maybe just by comment or by thumbs up or check mark, does that address your questions around threshold? Perfect. So in terms of mitigating strategies, so this is when we've now identified our top 10 list. So what you want to do is you want to go through and figure out what can we do to manage these risks. And there's a lot of good tools in the resource guide around the types of risk management activities that you can do. I would honestly say that in practice, I'd say 60 to 70% of mitigation strategies fall in that mitigate category. I think as organizations we have, or as individuals, whenever we see a risk, we always want to do something to control it. Whether or not it's we have traffic light signals, we want to install brakes in our cars, we want to install signal lights so that when we're changing lanes, people can see that we're doing that. Those are controls that we're putting in place. When we work with organizations, we just caution whether or not you always want to put in mitigation strategies. Sometimes you might be comfortable with that overall level of risk, and you might just say, we're going to accept it. The other side of it is, and I've mentioned this before, is you only have a limited resource in terms of cost, time, and budget to implement mitigation strategies. So although you may want to mitigate it, it might be extremely costly to implement a mitigation strategy. In that case, you might just say, we're going to accept it. So as you go through, you might just say, we're going to mitigate it. And in the short term, we're going to identify how much it might cost to implement something. But in the long term, you might then change your opinion to say, we've accepted the risk because we don't have the budget to implement the pieces to mitigate the control any further. So that's some guidance in terms of how to mitigate strategies.
Great, thanks, Paul. I guess one other thing that I wanted to add to what Paul had said is that putting your likelihood and impact together, it sounds like it could be really subjective on whether the likelihood was between 1 and 5 and whether the impact was between 1 and 5. But within your resource guide on page 28 and 29, it actually gives a lot of guidance in helping you to determine where your likelihood and impact could fall so that you become more consistent. And you can also have multiple people help to calculate your risks. So just wanted to add that as well. The next question, can we get a copy of the slides? Absolutely. That's from Municipality of West Elgin. If you could either just send me an email or put your email address at the bottom in the chat box, I'd be happy to send them to you. So the next question, are there any recommendations for council getting buy-in to start the process? I think that's a great question. And I'll even add to that for getting council or other areas within administration to start the process. So thank you for that question, and I'll pass it back over to Paul.
I think this is a fantastic question, and I'm glad that it came up. There's a number of recommendations that we suggest to organizations when starting an ERM program. The first piece is to just plant a seed in council or anyone's mind as to that you're going to be doing risk management. And that's just simply notifying them that you're taking on these initiatives. But the challenge is in articulating the what's in it for them of risk management. For council, I find that it's a bit easier in articulating the value or those charged with governance. And the reason I say that is because it's about letting them know, or just even asking them the question of, what are the risks that you feel are going to impact the municipality that you're not getting enough information on? And when we have these conversations with councillors, we find that they say, well, I don't feel I get enough information on our procurement. I don't know whether or not we're doing sole sourcing appropriately. I don't know whether or not we or have the right amount of property taxes next year in our forecast. So this will help you identify what are the key areas that are relevant to council. And chances are you can find this out through looking at existing council reporting, or if you even attend council meetings, because you'll start to hear what are the trends there. So the recommendation in terms of getting council buy-in is to let them know that ERM or risk management exists to help them get an understanding of how those risks impact the municipality, but also it exists to help them understand what the municipality is doing to control or mitigate those risks. So when we work with organizations, it's about trying to obtain an understanding of what are the key things that either administration or council are concerned about in terms of risk, and articulating to them the value that risk management and ERM bring to them. And even if it's just saying on a quarterly basis or on an annual basis, we're going to give you a report that shows graphically on 2 pages how significant these risks are to the municipality. This can give the councillors or administration the comfort that they need to directionally see whether or not the municipality is doing anything to decrease the level of risk. The tools that we showed, I'm just going to scroll to them here. In terms of the heat map and the risk page, I find that these are the 2 things, the 2 pages that councillors and people, and administrators really find to add them the most value. So we usually bring this in and show them example of a risk map and a risk register to say this is the kind of tools and reporting that you'll get, and that'll help you prioritize your review from a governance position when looking at risk management. That's probably the best types of tips I can give you in terms of getting council buy-in to start this process.
Thanks, Paul. I don't see any other questions, but I'll ask a couple of my own. So near the beginning, there was the pyramid that showed the link between strategic planning, ERM, and then a link between asset management, disaster planning, etc. And I'm just wondering if you can help articulate how does ERM fit into the budget process, and how can people make that link really tangible?
Thank you, Jennifer. So I just want to talk about this pyramid in the context that at your municipality, you've already do a lot of great activities around what we call the decisions that implement actions, your operational areas. And an example that you've picked up on here, Jennifer, is the budgeting process. So when you do your budgeting process, you'll identify a number of risks that will impact your municipality. And they can be as simple as municipal revenue, your property taxes, or how you're able to spend within your municipality around infrastructure. Do you have enough budget for policing? Do you have enough for your asset management? So in your budgeting process, you're going to identify a number of areas where you might have either a funding shortfall or a revenue deficiency. And as you go through those areas, those can result in risks related to the services that you deliver to your municipality. A key example here is you might not have enough revenues in your municipality to be able to support all the programs and infrastructure that you'd like to implement. And I picked that as a great example because you can mitigate this risk. You can say that it's a high risk, however, we have provincial grants that we apply for as a mitigating control. We have debt that we can draw on as a mitigating control. So the next step would be to say is, well, what are our debt levels at? Do we have enough space to continue to draw on debt? How long can we draw on that debt for? So that's how you can tie in your budgeting process into your enterprise risk management through what we call risks in the financial category.
That's great. Thanks, Paul. And don't be shy if you have questions. Feel free to type them in. I'll ask another question then. I guess the question that I would ask is, it seems like this process could become overwhelming because there's a lot of different steps and a lot of different risks. What would be your tips for municipalities that are just starting on this? They might not have a lot of people working with them. How should they get started and where should they prioritize their time? And as well, maybe you could give a sense of how long you estimate it would actually take to set up the ERM in the risk register, and does it take a long time to update and that sort of thing?
So in practice, when we work with organizations to implement ERM, we usually set a 3 to 4 month window in terms of the start date from when we commence establishing policy to the end date when we have a completed risk register that's ranked with mitigating strategies. So when you implement ERM in your organization, you'll want to look at and say, okay, we know that, and unless you have someone in your organization who is going to be dedicated to this process, it's not going to be feasible to do this all within 1 week. Chances are you're going to be doing other responsibilities in your program and in your roles. So the recommendation that I'd come through with is to set a roadmap and a plan on how you intend to implement ERM. And that starts with the first piece on your governance. How are you going to create that policy and procedure and obtain buy-in from council and others? Through this piece, you'll look at what are the objectives of your municipality and how can ERM support those objectives. And in this piece, you'll also look to define who will be responsible for ERM. Once you've defined who's responsible for ERM, it can help you in defining your roadmap because you'll know the availability that that individual will have to dedicate towards risk management. And this person might start out and set out what are the external conditions, identify the risks associated in there. Then create that risk register listing and circulate that within the municipality, maybe over a week or 2 period, to say, does anyone else feel that these risks encompass everything that we're facing? Is there anything that I'm missing? Then what you do is say, okay, now we've created and agreed on this is our risk listing. What we'll do is score it. So usually what you do is you can run a risk workshop and you can sit with a number of individuals and have conversations about the language of the risks. And you can also apply the risk impact and criteria categories to come through with a consensus on that total risk score. You might think that something is extremely high impact and low likelihood, but someone else might have a differing point of view. And these risk workshops are meant to capture those discussions and get that conversation started. The other piece that we find is sometimes organizations will just send around an Excel risk register and say, put your scores in here. We're going to take the averages and then put them into our final risk register. So there's different ways you can do that piece there. So in terms of implementing ERM, what I'd say is make sure you create a roadmap at the start and set realistic time-bound expectations on when you expect to achieve the different steps of ERM. Depending on the resources you have available, a 3 or 4 month window to implementing the first completed risk register is not unrealistic. So I think that you'd asked about the how, where, and sense of how long. Jennifer, do you feel that that captures those points?
And the other question was, how long will it take to update annually? It wouldn't take the full 4 months, would it?
No, on an annual basis, it does not take that long to update. That's a great point, Jennifer. The first time you set up ERM, there's a lot of learning in terms of determining what are the risks that impact your municipality. The next year that you go through ERM, it might only take you maybe 7 hours over the course of a week to update your ERM register. You could do it over a 2-week period as well. And the reason I say that is on an annual basis, you're just doing a refresh of the listing. You're saying, do these risks still make sense? Then you're saying, are we aware of any external factors or any new factors that are new risks that don't exist in this listing? And then you do a sense check with the council or others and say, do we still feel that these risk ratings are appropriate, or do we want to revise them? So it's not nearly as time-encompassing of a task in doing an annual refresh.
Awesome. So the next question we have is, can this be used as part of the financial budget process?
So yes, when we work with organizations, we recommend that they start ERM with their financial budgeting process or their business unit planning process, or even their asset management, capital management processes. And the reason for that is we tell organizations to flag to others that are responsible for budgeting or those other areas, to get those areas to flag to them what are the key risks that they foresee impeding or that might threaten their ability to achieve their budget, that might threaten their ability to achieve their asset management processes. Because this will help you in your risk management role. The onus won't be on you to identify every risk. Now you've helped push that down to others and help them help you, because now they're going to be telling you what risks exist. So then you're going to roll those risks into your enterprise risk management register and then look to align that at the same timing as your strategic plan. So yes, absolutely, you should do it at the same time as your budgeting. I acknowledge that you might have limited resources around that, but that's something that a best practice, you do it at the same time as your operational decision making takes place.
Thank you, Paul. The next question, do you know of any municipalities in Alberta that have a good risk management process in place?
I personally haven't worked with any municipalities in Alberta that I would say have followed this methodology for implementing risk management. I'm a little hesitant to say whether or not they have good risk management processes in place. I believe the reason you're asking is because you're wondering who you may be able to reach out to get resources from. I might suggest starting with the City of Calgary and City of Edmonton, because they're larger and would most likely have more well-embedded risk management processes in place. However, they wouldn't necessarily have followed the AUMA ERM toolkit in applying a holistic ERM framework.
Thanks. One other thing I'd like to add to what Paul said is it might actually be useful to have several municipalities get together to talk about their ERM registers and think together, especially if you're within the same region, you might have similar risks, or if you're about the same size, you might have the same size or the same types of risks, for example, relating to policing costs, or relating to homelessness and affordable housing, or other kinds of risks that you might want to identify, and you might even be able to find some sort of synergies in working with other municipalities. So just an idea there. Ed, if you could give an indication if that answered your question or not, that would be helpful. The next question, will this system keep track of previous risk assessments as they change over time? Paul, over to you.
So the tool was currently designed to help you create and score the risk assessments. You can do an assessment of how they changed over time by doing a look back to prior years, but it currently does not include, for example, a specific report or dashboard that will pop up and say, last year this risk was scored with 16, this year our risk assessment is scored at 18.
And with that one, I would suggest if there's a particular risk that you're really interested in, that you want to look at specifically, you could save your previous risk registers and look at your risk score that you've come up with every year, both your I guess particularly at your residual risk, and you might want to plot that in Excel or somehow display that there's been an increasing or perhaps an increasing risk. So that might be a way to show that.
And sorry, Jennifer, one other thing I want to add in the context of tracking previous risk assessments. That's something that not a lot of organizations do year over year. I'd say the more integrated or more advanced organizations that deal with enterprise risk management will have a track of previous risk assessments. It wasn't included in this piece because we didn't want to overcomplicate risk management implementation for ERM in the first instance.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and that probably for, especially as you're just starting out on this, to be able to show what the risk was before you had any mitigating controls, and then what it is after you've implemented some mitigating controls, I think that that's probably sufficient to show what the change has been. And the council reports that we have, those will automatically generate those types of charts so that council will be able to see how the risk has moved within the heat map. Looks like there's a couple more questions coming up, so I'll just wait. That was a really good segue, Ed, bringing us up to our last line about who to talk to if you have questions. Myself and the folks in AUMA in the advocacy area would be happy to help you out. Specifically, if you have questions about using the risk register, navigating through the system if you're new to using macros, how to enable the macros, and where to go and where to enter different pieces within the risk register, and how those link back to the resource guide. We'd be happy to help you with that. If there's something more comprehensive that you'd like in terms of having somebody facilitate a process with you, we can maybe also help you put together some ideas in looking for some external resources to help you out with that. So I'm still waiting here for, okay, a thank you from municipality. Any more questions that you would have? Hearing no more questions, I thank you all for your participation today. I think it was a really great webinar, and I think Paul did a fantastic job of going through the resource guide and the risk register. So I encourage you all again to download both of those resources and to email myself or advocacy if you have any questions. So thanks again, and I wish you a great afternoon. Oh, and one more thing, this will be available on YouTube, so you can listen to it again and again if you have any questions. Thanks.